The White Howlers are probably the Garou's most infamous tribe. They survived an ice age, survived war with other Garou tribes, and tricked a sun god into ending the ice age. One bit of history that isn't talked about as much with the White Howlers is the fact that they went to war with Rome. So let's talk about the White Howlers, what happened to them at the end of the Ice Age, and how successful their war was against Rome. Towards the end of the Ice Age, it is fair to say that the White Howlers were scattered. Their numbers were spread out among the world. There were those who stayed in their original cairns, their homelands, and when spring was finally in the air and things started to turn for the better, the White Howlers sent a message to all of their brethren, to all of the tribe, and that single message was, "It's time to come home." The message went wide and it was very well received, and return they did to their original homelands in Caledonia. From across the mountains, overseas, from the islands, come they did, and they brought their kin with them. Now let's just think about this for a second. You had a core group of the tribe. They stayed in their homelands. They stayed in Caledonia. They fought the ice. They struggled and they survived. And then you had the other groups, those who went out among the world, learned new ways. They brought with them new traditions and new ways of doing things. Integrations between these groups, they were not easy and it was not simple. They had been apart and separated by the ice for thousands of years. Those that stayed in their homelands, they didn't remain in one place. They never really built society or built a city and set down roots. They followed the herds, they followed the animals they hunted for food. Now this was in stark contrast to the other groups, the other Garou who were out among the world and were able to build that sense of community. They learned to tame livestock. They learned to cultivate and farm. Those that stayed and survived within the ice in their homelands, they believed themselves to be more closer spiritually to Gaia than those who were coming back. Cairns that had been abandoned, long since forgotten, sacred places to the White Howlers. Now that they had more members coming back in, more of their number, they were able to go out among these sacred places and try to rebuild those spiritual connections. It's here we have the conflict of old school versus new school. The elders of the tribes, they had serious doubts, very big concerns about incorporating farming, animal husbandry into the White Howler way of life. The new school of thinking, they tried to teach the elders that when you incorporate these elements into daily life, survival is not as hard and you don't need to spend as much energy just trying to survive, which means there would be more time to find the worm's corruption and root out this evil. The old way of thinking, the elders said that these lifestyles, these tools were crutches which made you weaker, unable to hunt as effectively in Gaia's service. The end result was not something as simple as yes, we will do this or no, we won't. It was much more nuanced. Some of the new Karens fully embraced the new way of life and they were better for it. Others denied it, and some were somewhere in the middle. Now, unfortunately for the White Howlers, this led to a big problem for them, but one they were not immediately aware of. Before we continue on, if you're new here, my name's Nathaniel. I talk world lore around role-playing games so that you can have a better and more in-depth experience with your players. If that's something you're interested in, I would love to have you join me at the table. Do so by hitting that subscribe button, and if you're getting some value out of the video today, I would really appreciate it if you hit that like button for me. Now back to the story. During this reintegration process, their rebuilding of the tribes and setting down roots, they inadvertently caused a period of isolationism, and they were not interacting with the other tribes. They were not interacting with the outside world as much as they tried to rebuild their own strength. So when the Romans finally did make it to Caledonia, the White Howlers did not immediately see them as a threat. They had learned their lessons from generations before around immediately jumping into violence and conflict with something that was new. They were, of course, cautious to the newcomers arriving in their lands, but they decided to give them a chance to prove themselves, and this would lead down a very dark path for the White Howlers. Because of the time that they spent isolated from the world, they had no concept, no idea of how large Rome actually was. They had no idea how powerful their armies were, how well trained they were, and the deadly efficiency of their Roman weapons. After all, the Romans were just merely human. They had no spiritual connection. They had no real warriors. At least this is what the White Howlers thought. The White Howlers were Gaia's chosen warriors. Who could possibly best them in a trial of combat? As many downfalls go, it didn't start with a bang. It started with something small. At first, the Romans introduced themselves with scouts. They were just investigating the area. They were seeing the new lands and seeing what was out here. The White Howlers met them, showed them around their homeland, and broke bread with them. Then the diplomats started coming. They offered sweet words and wonderful promises of peace and prosperity. Months turned into years, and more the White Howlers became accustomed to the presence of the Romans. More scouts would arrive in the area, more diplomats would show up, and then suddenly, armies started to show up, entire battalions of Roman soldiers. The Romans set up camps, which eventually turned into fortresses. Those fortresses eventually turned into settlements as the years went on. It's not to say that this time was perfect either. There were conflicts between the White Howlers and the Romans, but conflict was nothing new to this area. And the fact that there was conflict wasn't a surprise to the White Howlers or the Romans either, which is why it wasn't alarming when there was a small uptick in tribal violence between different groups of the White Howlers. It took some time to realize, but what the Romans were doing, they were playing the different tribes against each other. The Romans would offer aid and protection and trade with one particular tribe as long as they went to war and attacked opposing members of a different tribe. Some White Howler tribes did fall for this, but vast majority saw the game for what it was, and they refused the protection of the Romans, which led to the ire and the feeling of betrayal from Rome. And Rome responded in a significant way. Their response was swift, violent, and merciless. During the time that the Romans were investigating and coming to the lands of Caledonia, it would be fair to say that the White Howlers were distracted. There was a significant uptick in worm activity, and the White Howlers were trying to combat it. Now, whether or not this surge of worm activity is correspondent to the Romans or not has been a matter of great conjecture within the tribe itself and the history books, but what it did is it put the tribe in a state of going to put out one fire after another, and they were not able to properly take the time and assess the big picture to see what was going on. Had they been able to, they might have seen the true intentions of Rome much earlier than they actually did. During this time, spirits that were long since silent, that had long slumbered, ancestral spirits began to awaken. They began to make their presence known. Poltergeists began terrorizing the land. Night hags were stealing children from cairns. The White Howlers, who were spiritually inclined, better spiritual warriors, they also had their hands completely full during this time as well. Being spiritually and physically divided, the White Howlers did not realize that they would never be able to take on the Romans head on until it was nearly too late. However, there was one advantage that the White Howlers had above the Romans, and that was the fact that they knew these lands. This was their home. They understood it, the heart and the soul, the physical landscape of it. They knew it in a way that the Romans never would. And fight the Romans they did. They harried them back to the seas. They took down their fortresses until the Romans could do nothing except build walls in an attempt to keep the White Howlers at bay. The White Howlers, emboldened and feeling excitement about being able to take back their homelands and get rid of these foreign invaders, had their hopes and their dreams suddenly crushed as they started to see ships coming to shore, ships so large that they were big as cities themselves, full with not only Romans, but also twisted minions of the worm. And from here, The White Howlers went to battle not only with the Roman soldiers, but also with the twisted and putrid armies of the Fomori. Now, how well did it go for them? Well, you'll just have to click here and find out. Thank you to all of my patrons for supporting me and the channel. My name's Nathaniel. Thanks for stopping by, everyone.